Let me begin with something that will unsettle you. Not because I wish to be provocative, but because the truth, stripped bare, is almost always more disturbing than any provocation. On the 8th of October 2023, the morning after the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust, the State of Israel did not only begin a war, it began a reckoning with something far older, far more intimate, and far more terrifying than any rocket. It began a reckoning with death itself, with its weight, its sheer, logistical, ungovernable mass, because on that day and the days that followed, thousands of Israeli bodies had to be identified, prepared, and buried, and the infrastructure of an entire society buckled. The streets of Tel Aviv went silent, not from grief alone, though grief was everywhere enormous and raw. They went silent because the machinery of the living had been completely commandeered by the dead. Now I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A modern city, one of the most technologically sophisticated metropolises on the planet. A city that gave us the startup nation, the Iron Dome, the drip irrigation system, and yet Tel Aviv stopped. It was paralyzed because there were simply too many dead to bury and nowhere left to put them. This is not merely a story about war. This is a story about what happens when a political project, in this case the Zionist project, the Israeli state, runs headlong into the physical limits of the land it claims to occupy. This is a story about the fundamental contradiction at the heart of a nation that has never fully resolved the question of space. Who lives where? Who dies where? And who, in the end, gets buried where? Let us talk about the bodies. More than 200 civilians and soldiers were killed in the Hamas attack of October 7, 2023. Their bodies, and fragments of their bodies, had to be identified and released for burial. The Israeli forensic system was overwhelmed immediately. Bodies were delivered to a central mortuary. Each body was coded, undressed, examined, digital fingerprints were recorded, DNA was sampled, dentistry was performed, CT scans were conducted for the disfigured, for the burned, for those whose remains could not be assembled into the shape of a person. And simultaneously, the war began. The reserves were called up. 300,000 reservists were mobilized. Tel Aviv streets were locked down. The roads around Gaza were sealed. And the funerals, the thousands of funerals, had to somehow take place in a city, in a country that was simultaneously arming for the largest military campaign in its history. This is what paralysis looks like in the 21st century. Not tanks rolling through city streets, not bombs falling on your apartment. It looks like a cemetery that cannot absorb the dead fast enough. It looks like a burial society working around the clock and still falling behind. It looks like families waiting, numb, holding death notices, unsure where their son or daughter or father or mother will ultimately be laid to rest. And here is where I must tell you something that very few commentators in the Western media will tell you, because it complicates the simple, binary narratives they prefer. Israel was already running out of room for its dead, before October 7th, before any of this. Major cemeteries in the densely populated Tel Aviv and central districts, including those at Yarkon and Barkat, which were intended to serve as long-term solutions, are already expected to reach capacity as early as 2035. The annual number of deaths in Israel is projected to rise from approximately 45,000 to 50,000 today, to 100,000 by 2044, and to 200,000 by the 2080s. Let that sink in. 100,000 deaths a year. 200,000 deaths a year. In a country roughly the size of New Jersey, with one of the most rigid, religiously enforced burial traditions in the world. The National Insurance Institute pays for the burial of every resident who dies in Israel, every single person, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, to be buried in their residential area. It is, in a peculiar, almost poignant way, one of the most generous welfare commitments any government in the world makes to its citizens. You may not get housing, you may not get health care, but you will get a grave. Judaism has strict rules about burial. Bodies must be interred in the ground. Cremation is not allowed. And due to the belief in resurrection, when the Messiah comes, Judaism does not allow the moving of graves. Do you understand the magnitude of what this means? You cannot cremate. You cannot reuse the plot. You cannot move the body. Every person who has ever died on Israeli soil and been buried there remains there, permanently, eternally, taking up real estate in a country that is fighting, literally fighting, over every square meter of land. The paradox, as one report put it, is that because of a cultural, religious outlook, Israel devotes to the dead one of the country's most valuable and scarce resources. If strategic planning is not advanced, Israel will move toward a reality in which large parts of its territory become cities of the dead, in a land contested by the living. Now I want you to hold this image in your mind, and I want you to place it alongside another image, because this is where the moral and political architecture of the situation becomes truly, devastatingly clear. While Israeli families were mourning their dead in October 2023, while Tel Aviv was paralyzed by grief and logistics, in Gaza, in the rubble that was rapidly accumulating on the other side of the fence, Palestinians were also dying, in numbers that would dwarf the Israeli losses within weeks, and they were not getting the same burial. Families in Gaza were denied the chance to recover and bury their loved ones in a dignified manner. Thousands of families denied this most elemental of human rights. International humanitarian law imposes clear obligations regarding the treatment of the dead. Parties to a conflict must search for, recover, and respect the bodies of those killed. Bulldozing corpses into unmarked pits, destroying cemeteries, or leaving bodies exposed where families cannot safely reach them is a flagrant violation of those laws. Two peoples, one narrow strip of earth, and both of them, in the end, cannot even bury their dead. This is the condition that no politician, not Netanyahu, not Biden, not any of the diplomatic peacocks who fly into the region for their photo opportunities, will name directly. The land is too small. It has always been too small, not for the living alone, but certainly not for the living and the dead together. An architect who specializes in dense burial design put it with accidental brilliance. It is unreasonable that we will live one on top of the other in tall apartment buildings and then die in villas. If we have already agreed to live one on top of the other, then we can die one on top of the other. He was talking about vertical cemeteries, about stacking the dead in concrete towers because the ground is full. But what he described, without meaning to, is the entire political philosophy of the region. Everyone is already on top of everyone else. The question, the brutal, unresolved, permanently suppressed question, is who gets to be on top. Let me be direct now, as I always try to be, even when directness makes people uncomfortable. The paralysis of Tel Aviv in those days after October 7th was real. The grief was real. The horror was real. I do not diminish any of it. Over 1,000 people murdered in a single morning is not a statistic. It is a catastrophe. And the scale of the funeral burden, the logistical, emotional, and spiritual weight of burying so many so quickly, was a form of secondary trauma visited upon an entire society. At a funeral in the Kiryat Shaul military cemetery outside Tel Aviv, hundreds of people stood in the pouring rain to mourn a 24-year-old captain killed in Gaza. A young woman who had been his schoolmate said, "There is a quote in Israel that says it is good to die for our country. I don't feel like this anymore. Is it good to die for a country that is not functioning, that celebrates the hate between us?" She said that in January 2024. Imagine what she thinks now, because here is what happened next. The war continued, the funerals continued, week after week, month after month. The flag-draped coffins were carried into the ground. By the end of 2025, 151 Israeli soldiers had lost their lives that year, the lowest annual toll since the war began, and less than half the number recorded in 2024, which means 2024 was worse, which means that for 2 full years, there was a procession of young Israelis being lowered into the same overflowing cemeteries that were already running out of space before the first shot was fired. By June 2025, 431 Israeli soldiers had been killed and more than 268 wounded in the Gaza invasion alone. The bloodiest single day was January 22, 2024, when 24 IDF soldiers were killed after an attack on a tank rigged with explosives. 24 families, 24 funerals in one day, across a country the size of New Jersey. And on the other side of the fence, because there is always another side of the fence, and any honest person must say so. A study by the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research estimated the total number of violent deaths in Gaza was between 100,000 and 126,000, of which 27% were children under 15 years old, 100,000 people, in a territory of 2 million, with no functioning cemetery system remaining, with hospitals destroyed, with the forensic infrastructure obliterated, with families unable to even locate the bodies of their children. 2 peoples. 2 burial crises, one existential, long building, and rooted in demography and religious law, the other sudden, catastrophic, and rooted in the application of overwhelming military force, both revealing the same truth, that this land cannot contain what is being asked of it. Now, what does Varoufakis? What do I say in the face of all this? I say this, that the leaders who sent the young men into the tunnels of Gaza and the ideologues who celebrated the attack that triggered the war share something in common that neither would ever admit. They both trafficked in abstraction, in flags, in sacred geography, in the theology of territory. They both treated the land as a symbol rather than as a place where actual human beings, fragile, mortal beloved, must live and die and be buried. And the reckoning comes always in the form of the specific, the individual, the irreducible, the body that must be washed and wrapped and placed in the ground. Tel Aviv was paralyzed because the abstract, the geopolitical, the ideological, the theological had for a moment to confront the concrete, the weight of a single coffin, the sound of a mother at a graveside. The question of where in an overcrowded, contested, sacred, ancient, and exhausted land you put the people you have lost. A rabbi who oversees burial in Jerusalem once said, "The cemeteries will grow and grow, and this will be at the cost of the living. In a few hundred years, we won't have space to live here. Something is wrong with the system." He is right. Something is wrong with the system. But the system is not just the burial system. It is the whole arrangement. The political arrangement, the military arrangement, the arrangement by which one population's grief is mourned loudly and internationally, while another's is counted in footnotes, or not counted at all. I have said before, and I will keep saying, that the only possible future for that land, for any land, is one in which both people's dead are treated with equal dignity, in which both people's living are treated with equal rights. Anything less than that is not a solution. It is just a postponement of the next catastrophe. Tel Aviv was paralyzed the day it had too many dead to bury. Gaza has been paralyzed, economically, physically, morally, for decades. When we are honest enough to hold both of those truths at the same time, without flinching, without reaching for a flag to hide behind. Then, and only then, might we begin to talk about something other than the next war. Until then, the cemeteries keep filling, and the question of who belongs to this land, the living or the dead, and which living, remains as it has always been, unanswered.